All right. Can't wait to play this sick new game with the crew. Just have to get through the tutorial.
Welcome to the game. In this game, you'll be...
All right, Skip.
Please look down at your hands.
Okay.
These are your hands.
Yes,
These let you
obviously.
interact with the world.
All right, Skip.
To interact with the start menu, raise your hand and point at the button.
God.
Then, pull the trigger on your right.
Skip.
Great work. In this game, you can sometimes grab objects. In order to grab an object, reach out your hand and press the
Okay,
grip.
Skip.
Fantastic. Now you are going to learn how to walk.
Are you fucking...
Using your legs, place one foot in
serious?
front of the other in order to translate your body forwards.
All right,
This allows
screw
you to
this.
move through
I'm
the
bored.
world at the pace of a human. Congratulations! You are now ready to play head-mounted destinations. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to Head-Mounted Destinations, a podcast about VR and VR game development. We provide our perspective as developers and provide a sneak peek behind the curtain for anyone interested in how VR games are made. I'm your friendly neighborhood game designer, Carlos, and with me, as always, is...
Matt. I'm a gameplay engineer.
And today, we're talking about how to train your player.
Real quick, I want to give an example of the kind of things that you run into as a developer and you're trying to get people into the game. Because you, listener, you might be a super cool, seasoned VR player who is never confused. But when you're a developer and you're doing usability testing or just play testing in general, you're going to get a wide variety of people and you're going to be putting them in the headset. And I would say about 50% of the time, people will not move or look around or do anything, even though that's what VR is all about, right? It's all about putting them in this virtual space. But if you stick them in the game, and you say, walk up to and grab this thing, they will just reach out their hand, and their hand will be too far away to grab it. And they'll just tap the trigger and be like, I don't get it. Why am I not grabbing? Or like they won't even like look up. And so you're coming in and somehow your game has to teach players that they can like move their feet or like interact with the environment at all. But then the moment that you do teach the player that, oh, you can grab a thing, and they sort of realize what's going on, that it's VR, now they're like, oh, it's just like real life. I can grab everything, right? So now they're trying to grab everything, but of course they can't grab everything. And on top of that, you got to teach them what the heck they're actually doing in this game, what their objective is. And people don't read. People don't look at images that you show them. People don't listen to things that the game tells them with audio. In fact, if you draw a line to a thing, about half the time, they'll just totally ignore that line that's pulsing and like shooting light rays at the thing they're supposed to look at. It's a huge issue.
There are just a lot of players who don't really understand how to communicate with the world around them.
Yes.
Like whether it be in a non-VR game or exponentially more difficult in a VR game. Like Matt was saying, oftentimes new players will be very hesitant, especially new VR players will be very hesitant to move around in their space at all. If they have like more than standing room to like walk around in, it's a very real concern that someone may like walk into a wall by accident, you know, if they're so fresh to the VR world. Also, like, what the heck do each of these buttons do, right? Like, even people who come from a traditional non-VR gaming background, like they know A, B, X, Y, they know shoulder buttons and triggers, they don't necessarily understand that carried over for the most part to the VR marketplace with like the Oculus controllers kind of aping that design and like breaking it in half with each motion controller, and the other manufacturers like kind of following suit. So we at least have somewhat of an analog from non-VR to VR, but it's presented in such a way that even some people familiar with it are kind of confused on how to interact with it or use those things. Those are your tools to interact with the world. So really, how to train your player is equal parts how to teach your player to use the tools in their hands, aka the controllers, to communicate with your world, and then to take it a step further, what language within the world can the player use to like enable gameplay.
Right. But of course, everyone has had the experience of going through a boring tutorial where the game's talking at you and dryly teaching these concepts. So we're also faced with the extra challenge of how do we get all of this into the player's head, but without just sitting there and telling them.
Yeah, like how do we start the game in a bombastic way that isn't you just spawn in a dark void and it's telling you these are what buttons do and this is what a thing is, but more so maybe taking notes from games that we'll bring up later in the episode, such as Vader Immortal, where like the introduction will be more of a set piece cinematic narrative moment that gradually teaches you 1 or 2 or 3 button functions before bringing you to another chapter where later on it teaches you more stuff. So 2 ways to tackle FTUEs that we will certainly be diving into in just a little bit.
FTUE stands for what?
Oh yes, FTUE. Sorry, dear listener. So FTUE, FTUE, stands for First Time User Experience. This is literally the first time the user experiences the product, meaning if you're playing Fruit Ninja VR, that's when you have the headset on, you click the play button on Fruit Ninja VR for the first time, and like it just from black screen there, that is your first time user experience. Developers will tackle this differently project to project. We have seen these FTUEs where it loads you into a void before you even get to a main menu, and it's teaching you how to use the buttons and such. We've seen ones such as Until You Fall, where you have a main menu and you just point and click to select new game, and once you select new game, it kicks you into the FTUE. And we've seen just a litany of ways that this can be handled, and we'll be bringing up bits and pieces from things we've experienced to kind of hopefully develop a picture of good practices and or principles to follow when trying to train your player.
Yeah, so FTUE, at its highest level, it really just means literally the first time the player that uses the game, like, what are they experiencing? But it becomes a bit of a shorthand for just like boring tutorial sequence where you're having some discussion of like, oh, how will we like tell the player about this feature? We'll just throw it into the FTUE. To the point where like on a lot of games that have like meta systems of like you get points so you can craft stuff, or there's like battle passes that you can buy or whatever, the FTUE is like all those like boxes that pop up of like, here's how you do this thing and this currency is used for this, and you just like skip all the way through. So it sort of becomes this like junkyard of just like, I don't know how we'll solve this design problem, I guess we'll throw it into the FTUE. And so I think like it gets a bad rap from that side of things. But like I want to demonstrate at least what I think is a good FTUE from this game, this VR game that I worked on. It's like a 3D bubble shooter. You have a slingshot, and the first time user experience, a lot of VR games, you have to like calibrate height, or you have to like click start on a menu and you have like a laser pointer, you're interacting with the UI. But we figured, hey, what we want is the very first thing the player does, we want that to be the core mechanic of the game, right? Because their mind is open. They're like, all right, I'm going into this game, I don't know what to expect. They're going to latch on to the first thing that they do. So the first thing that we do, we show in front of them the ammo that's going to be loaded into the slingshot. And we say, grab this. What we do is actually they can use either of the common grab buttons to grab it. So they're learning, quote unquote, learning the button. We calibrate the height at that moment as well. Okay, so they've learned they grab this ammo in the slingshot. And then we spawn the slingshot in their hand and we say, pull the slingshot back and shoot it at this thing. And the thing that they're shooting at is the ultimate objective of the game, is you're trying to destroy these cores. Okay, so now they've learned how to use the slingshot. They've learned that you shoot the thing at this object, they destroy it. Victory. And now we move them on to the next level. Shoot these bubbles. You shoot the bubbles, it exposes another core. You shoot the core. Victory sounds again. And now the UI comes up. Instead of using some other interaction mechanic to interact with the UI, they use the slingshot to shoot the button to start the game. And so in this sequence, they've learned how to interact with the UI, yes, but more importantly, they've learned the core loop of the game without ever really being like told. Yes, there is extra helper messages that will come up if they don't succeed in the thing. It is very straightforward. We've front-loaded all the important aspects of the game into the very beginning in a very like intuitive sequence. That to me is the ideal scenario. you learn all about the game without realizing you're learning about the game and without realizing that you're being taught. That's the ideal first-time user experience. Of course, that's a very simple game. And so you start running into issues when you have a whole host of mechanics and multiple core loops. That's, I think, where you get bogged down and you get into the really boring tutorials that get a bad rep.
I don't know if introducing multiple mechanics during the FTUE automatically leads it to being a bad, potentially overwhelming FTUE. I think if we look at maybe things like The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners and Half-Life Alyx, we can draw some good data from these FTUEs.
Yeah, Saints and Sinners is, I think, an example of like it kind of teaches you everything in that first sequence, but it's not super boring.
It's not within the story either.
That's true.
I want to kind of nail into that a little harder. Like this FTUE in Saints and Sinners is still a kind of, you're in a warehouse, so at least they're using assets from in the game, but it's still an abstract location. It's not like when you complete the FTUE in there, you walk out the building and suddenly you're in the game world and now the game begins.
There's a character in there they literally call Tutorial Man.
Oh, I love Tutorial Man. This is actually, Tutorial Man is one of the reasons why Saints and Sinners FTUE is one of my favorites, because in the last part of the FTUE, they are teaching you how to talk to other characters. This game has a dialogue system. So, at this point, you've already been given weapons and you know how to use them. And if you so choose, you have the freedom to just kill the person, Tutorial Man, that you're supposed to talk to. And if you do this, it'll spawn in a new Tutorial Man who looks different. Like it just randomly picks like a male or female character to like talk to you, and then you pick a dialogue option, and you can just keep killing them like over and over in the middle of their sentences, and a new guy will walk out every time. And that's hilarious. That's a moment that breaks logic for the game world, but it's within the context of this abstract warehouse FTUE that you know isn't actually part of the world. So it's almost like equal parts acceptable and unacceptable.
Yeah. Well, it's a good example of like, you have to be very conscious of how you structure your tutorial and like the choices you make there, because as a developer, you have a bunch of things that you need to accomplish in order to get the game out the door. And you think, oh, we need to teach the player how to interact with a character. The easiest solution is to make them invincible, because it's a huge pain in the ass to program the ability for the player to kill them, and then you spawn a new one and all this stuff. But if you make an invincible Tutorial Man, then the player learns implicitly that you can't kill NPCs in the game, which is not the case in Saints and Sinners. In Saints and Sinners, you can kill anyone, and it impacts the story. It's funny, and it's like a good solution to it, but like it's also very important that you can kill Tutorial Man, because otherwise the player will learn the wrong lesson.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and one I definitely didn't identify till today, but within that game, there are many points that you'll be in the middle of dialogue with neutral, leaning towards hostile enemies, where you absolutely have the freedom to do what you did the Tutorial Man. If you wanted to just say, like, screw it, I'm going, like, full Negan, you're just like, bam, lay waste to whoever talks to you. And the tutorial lets you do that to know that it's possible, which goes from joke to like, oh my god, when it actually happens in the world. But probably the only thing it doesn't tell you if you were to do that is that a bunch of other NPCs around you are going to get mad and start shooting at you. So they teach that later on in the game, but that is not reserved for the FTUE. Something they do in the FTUE, again, referencing Saints and Sinners, this warehouse is not a freely explorable warehouse. It's a very linear sequence. So on and so on.
I watched this. Yeah. It's interesting. It starts in a black void, and it teaches you a couple of inventory management things, which is like ultimately the core of the game is fumbling around with the stuff that you have on your body, and manipulating it effectively. And then it puts you into the warehouse, has you grab a knife, has you stab a walker in the head as the first thing, stab a couple of walkers, teaches you about weapon durability, then teaches you about shaking zombies off, then gives you a gun, teaches you about shooting, they're communicating a certain importance level of each thing by ordering it like that, right? If they put guns before knives, now they're saying this game is mostly about shooting. But by putting knives first, they're saying, really, this game's about stabbing walkers in the head and fumbling around with like bandages on your arm.
It's saying this is a tactile game. In introducing the smaller, craftier, breakable stuff, it's also saying this is a game about, in a way, stealth, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you have this small shiv, take out this walker who's like kind of quietly mumbling, and it just kind of like builds from there, where using the pistol is going to be the obviously loudest option. I think they even give you a little heads up, like, hey, this is awareness or whatever. And a lot of this stuff is taught by in their FTUE, it's taught by either diagrams on a whiteboard that's like on a table in front of the player, and or little diagrams that appear next to the hand or character that the player is supposed to do something with.
Yeah, but I think it's important to understand, and this is one of the things that you learn almost immediately when you get into development. Players don't read. Players don't listen to things. Like, players will ignore 99% of the clues that you give them. So you have to give them every type of clue. And what that comes down to is like, yes, you have diagrams. You have lighting, right? You have like the well-lit areas are the things that they should pay attention to. You have potentially audio, some sort of voice. You have like lots of feedback on the thing, right? So you're teaching people, if you want someone to grab something, it highlights, it has a little sheen, it has a sparkle, it has a line from your hand to the thing. That line is pulsing with light going towards the thing. You maybe show the controller overlaid on top of their hand, and you show the glowing button, and you have like a line pointing to the button. You have haptics vibrating the controller that pulse at the same frequency as you're pulsing the highlight of the button that they're supposed to press. You have some sort of sound that's also pulsing at that frequency. You know, you have some sort of arrow that's pointing and it's moving and it's scaling up and down and changing color. You try to throw in as much feedback as possible to draw the player's attention to the thing that you're trying to teach them, in the hopes that they're going to understand, that they're going to like notice and pay attention to like one of these.
To give a little bit of credit to the player, it is partially like, you severely need to limit the amount of information you're giving to a player. Most players are not coming into a game to go like actually utilize like the biggest amount of IQ in their brain. Like they are engaging in a leisure activity that is a video game, and they want to know how to engage with your game, but they don't want to read a full like paragraph. A paragraph is far too much. We've seen like Nintendo really take this, a lot of what you said, Matt, Nintendo kind of takes to heart, and they work it in creative ways by keeping text short. When they mention characters, they add a picture. Like if someone says Bowser, it'll show Bowser's face next to it. The same for Peach or Mario. In Legend of Zelda games, as well as Mario games, like key items or characters mentioned are highlighted in a color on the text. So when it comes to VR and just general like info dumping on the player, you want to be as direct and concise as possible, right? So if your tutorial is turn on the generator, like you want it to be like turn on generator by pressing X, or like press X to activate generator. Like that's even more straightforward. And it could be even more straightforward by just having something say like activate generator, and then when you approach it, like a square button appears, and that new like pop-up thing that appears notifies the player, oh, I'm close enough, I have been given feedback by the world, and this thing is now beckoning me with a button I can see on my controller. The problem we have in VR, though, is that we can't see the buttons on our controllers once the game is actually happening. We often only see these controllers during kind of tutorial moments, like at the beginning of Vader Immortal, when they tell you to punch it on the thruster.
Yeah, I think this is more broadly can be described as like there's like a contract that the player and the game has. Really, the what you're trying to do at the beginning is you're not trying to teach the player every lesson, you're trying to teach them just enough that they can like bootstrap themselves in the world with like the implicit clues that it gives, as well as avoiding teaching them the wrong lessons. So like if they're going to need to press a button to do a thing in the game, you better make damn sure that they know where that button is and how to press it on their controller at the start. Otherwise, that's going to take them out of the game, or it's almost a violation of this contract of like, oh, I thought I only had to press trigger in this game, but now you're also making me press X all the time. And like, that's a jolt. So like at the beginning, making sure they know where X is on the controller and like what X means. And if X means doing my special ability, then you don't want to violate that contract later on in the game by having X do something else also. It's almost two sides of the same coin, right? You don't want to teach them the wrong lesson in the beginning. That wrong lesson perhaps being X is only used to activate your special power. But then also like that's now a contract. And so teaching the wrong lesson and violating that contract later is like the same thing. And a good example of that, I think, also is, here's a specific anecdote, is when I was working on Battle Wake, we had this issue where at the start of the match, none of the controls on the ship were interactable. You had this wheel in front of you, but because play hadn't started quite yet, we were doing some like, quote, pre-game stuff, we didn't make that interactable. But which is terrible because the moment people are put into a space and, you know, they understand, oh, in VR, I can touch things to interact with them, they're immediately going to try to touch things. And if they touch the wheel and the wheel doesn't react to that interaction, then the lesson that they've learned is this is not an interactable object. But then a couple seconds later, we're done with the pregame stuff, we enable it, and we're violating that contract, or we've taught them the wrong lesson. It seems like such a minor thing, like, oh, but like, for the majority of the game, you're interacting with this thing. So like, you know, whatever, they'll learn. But it's just like, it's another point of friction. And these things add up of like, oh, maybe you should make it interactable. But if you make it interactable, then they're going to interact with it. And do you make this ship start moving based on that interaction? But you need to do this pregame stuff. So if the ship is moving, that's going to be confusing. But if the ship doesn't move, you're teaching them the wrong lesson. And you get into this like spiral. And so the FTUE and like delivering all the correct lessons and not delivering any wrong lessons can also start feeding back into like, maybe we should change the total like structure of our game or like some core design elements, which is where I think it gets tricky. And then you get bad UX on the tutorial because it's like, whatever, they'll just play it once.
Yeah, I feel like that's a major pitfall that potentially a lot of VR devs fall into, is this is only going to be played once, and you know, we only need to get the bare minimum out so that they can get to the game. And to some extent, maybe a dev is inclined to downplay the FTUE because potentially like their own player experience has been, wow, this is annoying. This keeps me away from the fun part. Like, I want to play the game already. Even worse, if it's a multiplayer game, you're like, my friend invited me to play at 7. I like started the game up at 7 and now it's 7:15 and I'm still in a tutorial and I just wanted to play a game with a friend. Mm-hmm. Something about the fidelity contract that I wanted to mention with like the new button input, it's just another tutorial, or maybe rather than calling it a tutorial in that context, like, hey, you are already pressing grip button, now to charge whatever you're holding, like press A while you're holding it with the grip button, like that is just another learning moment. You don't need to put that in your FTUE per se, but if you are changing the rules of communication between the player and the world, you absolutely need to take a moment to teach that to the player, whether it be a set piece animation that shows you, oh, this thing interacts with this thing in a certain way, or some sort of dummy enemy that like just has no awareness of you, that just like allows you to use a tool on them or something. You just need another learning moment. Don't go into your game thinking players will just understand because something has been done enough in video games. There's always someone that's not going to get it or is going to misread it due to one reason or another.
I mean, especially in VR, because you've got all these new players that are importing wildly different assumptions about the world, whether it's they're expecting it to act exactly like the real world or they're expecting it to act nothing like the real world. And then you've got experienced VR players that there's certain conventions in VR games now that have been somewhat established that they're expecting it to be similar to that. Even if those conventions are maybe not the best overall, it's still lower friction to inherit them. There's also, when you're talking about like learning moments or teaching the player stuff, there's an extra layer there, which is people will not necessarily derive the correct lesson, even if you think it's a very simple, like, press this button to do this thing. Because people will accidentally press 2 buttons. They won't realize that they pressed 2 buttons and that the action will be performed successfully, and they'll take away the wrong lesson. They'll think it's 1 button when it's actually another. Or, you'll have like a canned animation and you think this is not a learning moment, but the player doesn't know that. They're sort of learning all the time. And so like maybe they like touch a thing when it's playing a canned animation and they believe that they've influenced it. And now they've quote, learned this belief that, oh, I can influence these things by touching them. And you're like, oh, no, but like, that's not, we weren't teaching you that. So
right.
like players will take away all these lessons that you didn't intend to teach them in the first place.
And that's what makes some developers inclined to restrict things even more, put you in the white void or whatever colored void, and only put a object in there. Let's take Superhot, for example, the killer app for virtual reality essentially everywhere. Their FTUE is literally like the white void. Here's an object. And then I think it says like grab the gun or grab the object, whatever. Mm-hmm. And in that, it teaches you how you're going to be starting every level by grabbing an object. The white void is going to fade away and an enemy will like be present. It's a decent FTUE, but the mechanics of the game are so limited that they can get away with this. And also the narrative allows for it. Like they can get away with the whole weird white void thing. And here's one very specific action you should be doing. But for a game like Vader Immortal or Half-Life Alyx, or potentially even Until You Fall, that's like a little too slow or a little too boring or a little too artificial.
Yeah. Although I guess the flip side of that is the more artificial something is, the easier it is to like have the player shake off false assumptions almost. Like, yes, it's boring for the player, but basically the only thing they're going to take away are the explicit lessons that you've taught, right? Because they understand at a certain level that this is a distinct area where like I'm being told things. This is not the quote real game. So I guess there is some merit there. But again, the ideal scenario is that you don't have to have that. And that, I think about like, was it Shadow of War? Where basically throughout the game, you're constantly being prompted of like what actions you can do at a particular moment. So you never really have to learn button combos because the game will always help you out and tell you what you can do.
Right.
Taking that to VR, a good example is like highlighting, doing multiple things on interactable objects, right? Highlighting them and then like having a little white ring around them and stuff like that.
Yeah, we already see this in non-VR games, right? Like the modern era of games, something that kind of annoys me is the take on UI that is like, let's just put a white dot on it. I liked what we had last gen, and if anything, I was hoping for something more like colorful and impactful for interacts in future gens. But in non-VR games, let's say like The Last of Us 2 or God of War, when you walk up to an interactable object, you'll see like a white dot suddenly appear on the thing, and then I think if you get closer to it, the white dot will expand potentially, and then say like what button you need to press. I think that's a good system. I like the whole like notify and then get closer and then let me know what button to press. That's cool. And we see the button prompt thing in Asgard's Wrath for I think most of the time it's for like the characters and or stations that you can walk up and interact with, not necessarily for items.
That's a decision you have to make, is how much are you going to load that communication onto non-diegetic UI elements, and how much are you going to load it into the like visual language of the world. An extreme example would be a game where everything that you can grab, VR game, everything that you can grab, the grip of the object kind of looks like the actual physical controller, right? Like that's a very intense visual language choice of like, if it looks like a controller, I can grab it. And like, obviously that's very constraining. But I think that's also a big role of the first time user experience is like teach them the correct lessons about the visual language, right? You know, things that are green or whatever you can grab.
Right, yeah. If I recall correctly, Stormland, remember the open world robot Far Cry type game? Like the interacts in that, granted, you're a robot, but like when you approached interacts, like it would get the whole like digital outline to it. Like it would get like almost like you were a Terminator. Like you would highlight like a square around the interact. Or it could also, it was actually anything that was interactable in the sense of like you could touch it, it could touch you. So even like enemy plants in the environment got that like square outline, but it let you know like that's a gameplay object. I should be aware of this. And it was like equally identifiable for, hey, here's like a XP item. I'm going to grab it because it's highlighted. Here's a health item. It's highlighted in the same way. The way they allow you, the player, to take the next step in learning what your environment is like you have some sort of scanner that you could then use after it highlights something.
I would say, so I think the last element that we maybe haven't touched on is you have to account for the like wow moment of VR. And this has two effects. The first is you have to give, well, you don't have to, but you should give a moment early on in your game where there's no time pressure on the player and they can go like, holy shit, I'm in this virtual giant space, and they just like look around slack-jawed and they're like, whoa, VR is so cool. And then the flip side of that is when you're testing the game, you have to make sure that isn't affecting your test results. It's like, wow, people loved our game. It's like, no, they loved VR because they haven't played a lot of it. But so like that's an important thing that you have to take into account when you're designing the start of your game is you can't put time pressure on the player because the player is potentially going to take like 5 minutes to like pick up the object versus another player who's going to take 1 second to pick up the object because they're seasoned VR and they're in it. They're just trying to get through this thing.
Right. And something I'd like to add is, while I agree, definitely don't put the player in a dangerous, don't put the player in a like deadly scenario when they're learning something, especially for the VR, for their potential first time in VR, or their first time in any VR game could be another wow moment in VR. Like you never know. So you just always want to hope for the best and maybe design for the best, that like when players enter your game, they're going to want to be like soak it in and admire it. So what I wanted to say to that is like, it's probably mostly fine to make them seem like they're in danger. Again, referencing Vader Immortal, you're in the first moments, you're like, your ship is under fire and the character tells you to flick some switches and punch it. But no matter how long you take, you're not actually going to die. There is no fail state. So it gives you the illusion of something could potentially go wrong, but they still give you like the freedom to do it at your own pace. And that helps you to soak in the game at your own rate and, you know, just get into it.
Yeah, I think that's the important distinction, is there can't be a fail state. If I'm jumping into Vader Immortal, I am expecting as a player some amount of that like Star Wars adrenaline hit. And so it's a great like cinematic opener. But the fact that I can take as long as I need to learn the lessons of like, oh, flip these switches and like you can grab and move levers like this. It's important that I can take an hour if needed. The tutorial or the first time user experience, whatever, the things that we try to teach the player as soon as possible, it doesn't need to be the whole game. It just needs to be the bare minimum in order for the player to successfully bootstrap themselves up into playing the game. So that means like if you have an excessive tutorial segment, or you start thinking about throwing more and more stuff where you're just explicitly telling the player, it's like that's a bad sign. You should be taking as much as possible and sprinkling it out and embedding it into the world, into play, into the feedback and the mechanisms of your core mechanics, such that they are more learnable implicitly without instruction. And then you just want to think about what is the bare minimum number of lessons that the player needs to get in order to successfully build a mental model of how to communicate and interact with the world.
Right. Once you have that feedback set up where your gameplay actor or your gameplay object is basically having a conversation with the player via that feedback, whether it's like, as I shoot, I hear a progressively loud, dry click as the bullets in my magazine run out, or hearing like a ding, 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 like increasing tone for collecting multiple of a thing or punching someone in a specific sequence. Like, once you have that locked in and players can sort of understand the raw flow of that, then you can say, oh, we just need to highlight the buttons. Or, oh, we just need to draw a line from the button up to the player's eye level that says like what the action does. And that is your bare minimum that then the game handles carrying the rest of the way by having that feedback and or clear communication of like what is happening after they've done the inciting action.
Right. And this is a constantly changing problem too in the VR space, because even a couple of years ago, we were really seeing lessons of like players are totally new to VR. They don't have any expectation. How do we navigate that space? Now we're seeing a lot more of players have played previous VR games, and there are these conventions that are being built up. And so now our challenge is, what do we strip down away from that? And what do we build up in its place? And so now you have to think about what expectations are players coming into the game having played other games, and what do you teach in relation to that rather than building from scratch?
Honestly, that's kind of exciting. It sounds somewhat nightmarish, like the foundation is shifting under our feet every year because people's understanding of VR and how to interact / play is evolving, and it's great. I fucking love it. We are like nearly an hour in and I'm gonna drop an F-bomb. Like, it is awesome, man. We couldn't really walk around when VR started. Everybody was like, okay, it's either room scale so that I have the real life walk around, which we already identified had some issues with it, or I was just standing in one space, most likely facing my forward 180 degrees, and then just kind of like have my arms like, you know, bent at a 90-degree angle, and I'm like playing with my elbows tucked into my sides. Like, now it's evolved to the point that people understand like arm swing locomotion. People are more comfortable with doing joystick locomotion and with comfort options or without comfort options. And as the user base gains their VR legs, and more importantly gains a baseline understanding of like VR principles in a way, we're going to see things get so much smarter and cooler, and that's going to make some amazingly fun games, I hope. Yeah. Like 1 year from now, maybe we'll have like another like How to Train Your Player, and it turns out like we can do way more with 0G and flying because people like are ready for that. Who knows?
Yeah, I wonder, because I think it's still going to be a growing medium, and so we're still going to be seeing an influx of new players for the foreseeable future. But then like the gap between new players and seasoned players is constantly growing. And I guess just that ecology of like, you are not a game just alone, you are a game in relation to all the other games on the market and what they're teaching is also scary, because in a way it restricts experimentation.
You're stuck doing proven methods, right?
Exactly. Like, you have to do even more work in order to do something new, because you have all of these existing like arm swing or whatever lessons that people have learned.
Yeah.
Props to the pioneers that figured out how to teach players these new things. But now you have to do even more work in order, if you want to do it differently.
Yeah, for sure.
To summarize, the start of your game has to do a bunch of things. It has to teach the player about the world and how they're going to interact with the world and how they can't interact with the world. And it has to not only do these things in relation to your game, but it has to tear down existing assumptions that the player brings in from the real world or from other games. And it has to do this without boring them, which is just a mega huge difficult problem that's thorny from so many angles. And it starts feeding into the actual core design of your game and choosing how to make it teachable.
You don't leave the FTUE for last. You definitely keep it in your head. It's not the first thing you're building out, but as soon as you have those like core mechanics in and like maybe some like gameplay interactions set up, like you can start thinking about the FTUE, start thinking about what do I need to teach my player, what could potentially be new. And maybe the best piece of advice I can give to you as a listener, if you're trying to make a game and you're hoping people will play it, try playing your game assuming you've never played a game before, or at the very least, never played your game before and just don't know what the buttons do.
And remember, even though the player is only going to experience the first-time user experience once, it can harm their experience of the game significantly if it's done wrong. So it is a very important thing to think about.
Exactly. Make sure your game starts off on the best foot it possibly can. If you like this episode and want to hear more, please visit headmountedpodcast.com and sign up for our email list to get notified about new episodes.
You can check out the show on YouTube or Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, any of those platforms.
If you'd like to discuss the episode or suggest future topics, visit our subreddit at reddit.com/r/headmountedpodcast.
If you're loving the show and you want to help us out, you can follow our Twitter @MountedHead and our Facebook page @HeadMountedPodcast. Most importantly, you can tell your friends about us.
Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you at the next Head Mounted destination.